We like having conversations, tala noa, so let's just get closer to each other. If you can just move up to the front a little bit more, that would be great. Maneni? Oh, there you go. If we can just move up and fill up the gaps in the front. Thank you, thank you. You've been wondering, why am I knowing all the names? Just tell me all the names and I'll, what's that I see walking in? Yeah. Just tell them to round up the, anyone else you want me to single out? Yeah, and this is a breakdown, Stephen. So I don't know if you've got that, someone else hit it. Oh. So while we're waiting to start, can I just ask everyone that's coming in, just for this session, please, if we can make our way up to the front, let's sit a bit closer so that we can have a bit of a conversation, a tala noa in the Pacific. So for those that are just about to sit at the back, there's more seats here in the front. If we can please just make our way through. The presenters have specifically asked that we please move up to the front and fill up the seats. There's still more seats here. I actually don't have any time, and so I have no watch. I have no phone. You will be watch phone and no. So it's I can do the time. Yeah. Yeah, so I think she's got the time. Oh, you want to do? For those of you that have just come in, can you please make your way up and fill up the rows in the front? We're hoping to get a closer conversation with everyone coming through to the front, please. So, Te Lusa, just asking you, you guys to please fill up the rows in the front. We're asking everyone to please make their way through to the empty seats. Thank you.
Good morning once again. Thanks for coming to this session. The chair on the program, Mai, not available today, so we will have Melioni Yura who's going to chair this session. I'll hand it over to the chair now, Melioni.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Before I start, anyone that's actually coming in, we have asked specifically for this session, if you can please make your way through to some empty seats here in the front. As you all know, here in the Pacific, we love our talanoa conversations, so the only thing missing is a cover bowl or something, but we're trying to get that feeling and get everyone to just come up so that we can begin to have a closer conversations about the important issues that we're about to talk about. As you can see, the next session is on sending country governance, so I will go straight into it, into introducing the speakers, and we also have discussants here that I will introduce. Just note, we will leave all questions to the end. May I ask that when you have your questions, please state your name and your institution. It's really important for us to understand the context and really helpful for all of us. Without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Stephen House, Director, and Richard Curtin, Research Fellow, Development Policy Center from ANU. We have with us as well discussants. We have Matthew Gibbs from Labour Mobility Advisor, New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and we also have Mirelle Maldonolvin, the Vanuatu Labour Commissioner, who will present a paper later on. Stephen, please welcome Stephen on, and we'll go straight into it. Mala.
Good morning again, everyone. Thank you, Melioni, for stepping in as chair. I know some of you would have heard me yesterday. This is my last talk for the conference, and this is work I did with Richard, or we're doing. It's still work in progress. And in fact, the idea, Richard's going to be speaking to his own paper in the afternoon on skills, so I'm presenting this on behalf of both of us. We did get a bit delayed because of the other paper, and so haven't actually been able to share this presentation with our two commentators. So what you're going to be hearing are three perspectives on this issue of sending country governance. But I'm really happy with the panel we've got, because after all, Vanuatu is the biggest sending country into these seasonal worker programs, and it'll be great to get some perspectives from New Zealand, and in particular from Matt Gibbs, who's been involved with the program for such a long time. All right, well, let me start the presentation. Yeah, so this reflects our research over the last couple of years, really. In fact, some of you might have heard we presented on this almost a year ago, and this is our sort of second go at it. Our initial work on the seasonal worker program back in 2010 to 2014 was really about why the program was growing so slowly in Australia, what was holding it back. So we were interviewing employers. But over the last few years, as some of those constraints have been relaxed, the program's really grown, we switched our attention to the sending countries. And why is it that some sending countries have done so much better in Pacific labour mobility and in seasonal work in particular, and what can we learn from them? So that's what I'll be talking about. I think this you've already seen. This just shows that rapid growth. And then this is just to talk about the competition, right? There is a lot of competition for these places, even though we project a lot of future growth, about 30,000 in the next 15 years. This is our estimate of supply, so it's about 3 times as big, 4 times as big, excluding PNG. If PNG comes into the programs, there'll be even more competition. So it is a competitive process. What do countries need to do to succeed? And, by success, you'll see the main focus is on numbers, but there's also, especially towards the end, a lot on the integrity of the process and the probity, which is important for worker welfare as well as for sustainable success. So the objectives of this research are to understand how sending Pacific Island countries govern their participation in these 2 seasonal worker schemes. Second, to explain why there's such a difference in participation between sending countries, which I'll come to that. And then third, to see if there's any connection between the governance on the one hand and success on the other. This has policy relevance, of course. In fact, several Pacific countries at the moment are preparing Pacific labour mobility statements or considering legislation. So it's a good time to be doing research in this field. In terms of the structure of the presentation, I'm going to start with the second question, about the differences in participation and how we can explain them. So I think I had this graph yesterday, but this just sums up some of that difference in participation. Vanuatu is 40% of the two schemes combined since their start. Tonga 31, Samoa 16, Solomon's 5, and then it tails off. So some massive differences, and those differences are even greater if we look at it relative to population. Because if you were going to try and predict, well, what will the participation rates be, the first guess might be, well, everyone would send the same number of workers relative to their population. So the PNG would therefore dominate. But it hasn't been like that at all, right? And in fact, Tonga, although it's the second biggest sending country in terms of people per capita, is the most successful. So this is last year's, it would have gone up again this year, or 2018-19. But in 2017-18, 14% of the Tongan population, 20 to 45, were in either Australia or New Zealand working on farms. That's for some period of time in that year. So it's a remarkably high rate. Vanuatu is also pretty high, and even 4% of your population is very high, and it tails off pretty quickly after that. Actually, Tuvalu and Kiribati aren't doing too badly in terms of their population, but when we get to the bigger countries, we see much lower participation rates. How do we explain that? But, related to that, how do we explain the growth trajectories that we see? If we wind back the clock to almost the start of the scheme, 2008, Samoa and Tonga were almost identical, right? And Vanuatu was slightly ahead then. But if we go to where we are now, we see that, Vanuatu is almost double Tonga, and Tonga is almost double Samoa. So why have we seen these differences emerge over time? And it's not just a question for the big senders, but also some of the smaller senders. This is just for the seasonal worker program because it sort of makes the point clearly. But back in 2012, when the scheme was just getting going, you had a number of countries all sending just workers in the tens. And if we fast forward to today, they've all grown and they're all sending at least 100. But the massive differences have emerged, right? Samoa's done much better than the others, but look at Timor-Leste. That's really been the standout success among the smaller sending countries, going up to 1,400. And then another thing to explain is why some countries seem to do better in New Zealand and some countries in Australia, right? So one reason is again Timor-Leste, because it only takes part in the Australian scheme, right? And it's quite successful, so that takes up some of the share. But again, we see Tonga much more successful in Australia than New Zealand. Samoa, it's the reverse, right? A huge difference. And the same with the Solomon Islands as well. So there's a lot to explain, and I wouldn't say we've got all the answers, but we're on a journey to find out. And bearing in mind what we don't know, but also my time constraints, I'm sorry I won't be able to cover everything, and I look forward to your questions. But what might explain variation in participation, apart from sending country governance? We'll come back to that at the end. All right? Well, there are, first of all, a set of factors that are largely exogenous. That is, things that countries, there's nothing they could do about it. One is other employment opportunities at home and abroad, such as Nauru, right? With the processing centre, it's a busy place, right? People aren't looking for work. And similarly, the compact states. In fact, I think compact states theoretically could send workers to the seasonal worker program, but they don't. They go to the United States. A second factor is relative distance and expense and the structure of the economy. Right? If you don't have a strong agricultural sector, if you're a long way away, you are going to be disadvantaged. And I think that's a challenge that's faced Kiribati and Tuvalu. If you have broader internal challenges, I'll say more about PNG later, but I think PNG has been disadvantaged by its expense, law and order problems. It's not a place employers are going to put at the top of their list, and so that's a disadvantage it faces. And then finally, we have these, what we call early mover advantages. There seems to be, it's good if you can get in early. And in fact, it's interesting, the two schemes look very similar in this regard. So we'll look at RSE first. We have Vanuatu, Tonga and Samoa as the top three countries. And the fourth country is only a third of the third country, right? So it really falls away after the top three. And you can see, well, their share has fallen slightly. It used to be just above 90, and now it's sort of 85, but it hasn't fallen very much at all, really. It's quite a very gradual decline, if there is one. There's been, some adjustment within the top three. Vanuatu's done relatively well, but there does seem to be an advantage to get in early, and you can then grow with the scheme, right? So this is the early mover advantage, and it's derived from various things. New Zealand had a focus on getting Vanuatu into the scheme, so Vanuatu benefited from that. And then Tonga and Samoa no doubt benefited from that diaspora they have in New Zealand that provided natural contacts and channels of communication and build up trust. In Australia, there's more flux, but we still see the top three countries dominating. And in this case, it's Vanuatu, Tonga, Timor-Leste. Timor-Leste came along later, but remember the Australian program took a long time to grow. So even when Timor-Leste started growing, it was still a very small scheme. The big change is between Tonga and Vanuatu, where Tonga's lost market share to Vanuatu. But if we put the top three together, we take out the first year, which was a tiny year, again, it's a pretty stable share of about 85%, the same as it is in New Zealand. Right? So there is a question around these schemes. We think of them as Pacific labour schemes, but will they be Pacific labour schemes, or will they be largely dominated each by three countries? I think that's an open question at this stage. And then we come to factors that are more under the control of the countries, so things you can do something about, so largely endogenous factors, and I want to highlight three. So these can't really explain success, these are more part of success. Right? So one is worker performance, and there are certainly stories of workers that have been sent, especially selected by government in the early days from PNG and Timor that came largely from an urban background, weren't really used to working on a farm, didn't really like it, and weren't suitable. And that then gives the country a bad reputation because farmers talk to each other and they'll look to other countries. Similarly, Tonga suffered recently from a spate of workers absconding, right? And that's a big headache for whoever's hiring them. And that, again, will give the country a bad reputation. So these are worker performance issues, but it depends on who you select, right? And what sort of preparation you give them. It's not entirely under your control, but it's certainly influenced by that. Second is this issue around return workers. So one thing we've noticed is that the successful countries have a high reliance on return workers. Right? So let me just talk about this. I'm just going to focus on data from the SWP, just because I've got more recent data, but it's a similar story for the RSC. If anything, the SWP has more reliance on return workers than the RSC, which is interesting, and I'm not sure why. But broadly, the patterns are the same. So if you look over time, of course, the number of first-time arrivals falls every year because you've got this pool, a bigger and bigger pool of experienced workers, and basically employers test you out in your first year. If they like you and you like them, well, you'll come back. They'll invite you back and you'll come back. And so we see this blue line, which is the first-timers. Obviously, the first year, it's 100%. But after that, okay, there was a bit of a hiccup here, but it's basically falling every year. And in fact, this year, or the last couple of years, it's actually gone below 50%. So more than half of the workers now coming to Australia have been here before. And you can see now we're up to 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, even 8, 9 workers. So this has given rise to this kind of fear. Well, some people are making a career out of seasonal work, right? It's meant to be temporary, but in fact, workers are coming back year after year, and some are. But on average, it's not a big issue. And you can calculate the expected number of visits. We don't know this, right, because it's going to keep going, but once you've got a large number of workers coming for several years, you can assume, there's a sort of a decay rate, right? There's a probability of returning. You can assume that that's smoothly declining. And if you do that, this is what you get with the SWP. And you'll get different estimates each year because patterns might change, you get more data. It's not necessarily going to rise every year. It's around our estimates is around 3.5% to 4%. 4 years. So on average, we would expect a worker to come to the SWP. Our latest estimate is for 4 seasons. So it's there. It's not a one-off thing, and that's not how, you don't want it to be a one-off thing because it works because of these return workers. Some countries it's greater, some countries it's less, and there's still a bit of noise. I don't think this is a good estimate. It's just we don't have that much data per country. Now, what's interesting, because we're interested in comparing countries, is how this varies across sending countries. So one way to calculate this is visits per worker, and there you can see now we're on 2. And you can see it varies a lot across countries. Tonga is actually the highest from 2.3, and Nauru is the lowest, it is 1. But actually this is not a good way to estimate your reliance on return workers, because Tonga's been participating in the scheme a lot longer than anyone else. So it's had more opportunity for workers to visit. So there's an index that I've invented called the Reliance on Return Workers Index, which is 0 if everyone only comes once, right? And it's 1 if you're making maximum reliance on return workers. So when your numbers expand, you can't send return workers, right? Because you don't have them, the scheme's just expanded. But taking account of that, every worker who keeps going back indefinitely, right? And so this is an index from 0 to 1, and the average is 0.4, and again, Nauru is the lowest at 0, but most of them around 0.2, 0.3, and in fact, the highest by this index, which is a better measure, is Timor-Leste and Vanuatu. They have the greatest they make the greatest use of return workers, and Tonga, in fact, doesn't. Right? Tonga is actually below average. So there is some tension here because we've heard about equity. Countries want to spread the benefits. Everyone wants to go, and there's some resentment if the same workers keep going year after year. And this is something countries need to manage. I guess our message is that if you think the expected visit is only 4, it's not too big a problem. Plus, there does seem to be, it is a sign of success, right? If you have a lot of return workers going back, that means employers like hiring workers from your country. That means when they want new workers, they're going to come to your country and they're going to look for more workers. And here's just a little graph that we've done. I wouldn't say it's decisive proof, but there's some suggestion of a link that Vanuatu and Timor-Leste not only have the highest reliance on return workers, right, over here, but they've also shown the greatest growth in recent years, right? So we should be careful of thinking there's a trade-off between return workers and new workers, right? In fact, more reliance on return workers may mean more scope for new workers to enter the program. All right, and the final thing I want to talk about in these characteristics of success is employer patterns. I think we focus a lot on the countries, we don't focus enough on the employers. Who is actually hiring these workers? There are hundreds of improved employers, but the schemes are dominated by big players, right? Now, we don't have enough data on this. It's something we're working on. But one thing I noticed in New Zealand, they produce an annual report. So the median employer, the typical employer, hires 30 RSE employers. But the average is 86. And that's a huge difference, right? That means there are some very, very big employers, people who hire 1,000 or 2,000 workers, and then a large number of very small employers. There are 2 sorts of employers, what we call direct and indirect. They're both employers, but the direct ones employ the workers to work directly on their farms. The indirect ones are labour hire companies or cooperatives. They channel the workers onto other people's farms, right? So they're the indirect ones. And certainly the SWP is dominated by indirect employers. And again, we don't have the exact number, but our estimate's about 60 to 80% are labour hire companies. Right? Labour hire companies dominate the Australian SWP, not farmers. Indirect hire is also important in New Zealand. I don't have the numbers, but I'm going to guess it's at least half. And they're both labour hire companies, but also cooperatives. Some of the farms in New Zealand come together to form a cooperative, specifically to hire labour. And these indirect employers tend to be the biggest individually. For example, in Vanuatu, the top 4 seasonal worker hirers are labour hire companies. The top 3 in Tonga and the top 3 in Timor-Leste. The top 2 RSE hires in Vanuatu are grower cooperatives. So part of the secret to success is attracting one of these large employers, right? It's nice to get the small employers. It's good for the individuals involved, but if you really want to grow the program and get into the thousands, you need to attract these large employers. Not only are they large, but they have the potential to grow quickly because they don't need to invest, they don't need to buy more land, right? They just need to get more clients, right? Plus, because they're big, they're in the thousands, they know how to run the program, right? They are going to be less reliant on you if some problems occur. They have the infrastructure in place to deal with health issues around workers. They know how the system works. They don't want to be penalised, right? So they're less likely, I think, to exploit the workers. So how do you attract one of these large employers? Well, it's not easy, right? On the one hand, they like those return workers, right? We've already talked about that. Plus, if they're in a country, they know how it works, right? They're familiar with it. Why would you move to another country? On the other hand, you want to diversify your risk. You know, if you're recruiting only from Vanuatu and there's some big scandal in Vanuatu and Vanuatu is no longer part of the scheme, well, you're in trouble, right? So employers have that tendency, have that incentive to diversify. And we do see that with the big Australian employers. You know, Maidec, I think, is the biggest or one of the biggest, and it is now recruiting, I think, from 5 or 6 different Pacific islands, mainly Tonga, Vanuatu, Timor-Leste, but it is going further. So, but a big challenge for those countries that haven't really taken part in a big way is how do you get the big companies to come to your shore and then to expand? So, what is the secret for success? How do you go about governing labour mobility? So now I'm going to go to the second part of the presentation. I'm going to change tack. So this is based on studies of sending country labour mobility governance that Richard has done in a massive research effort, individually visiting and writing up his observations on the main participants. And not every country, but certainly the main participants in the 2 labour sending schemes. And then also we've had a number of discussions with employers and other stakeholders. And we've used this to investigate this issue of labour mobility governance. So what is labour mobility governance? It's all the arrangements around the actual work, right? So it's things like selecting the worker, right? Clearing the worker, getting them a visa, giving them the pre-departure briefing, promoting your country, promoting your workers to employers, helping workers, providing pastoral care and oversight when they get into trouble, disciplining them. You know, we had a discussion about that this morning. And then, you know, some governments are also keen on reintegration, helping the workers once they've returned. So it's many things. It's not necessarily done by government, right? So it may be, some of these may be done by government, some of them have to be, but others can be done by the private sector, by the community, by the workers themselves. There's incredible variation and detail in all this. And so for this presentation and just for our sanity, we've had to simplify a lot, right? And we've come up with these 2 models that we think provide a spectrum by which we can use to place countries. So one we call government light, right? And government light is the approach taken by the 2 most successful countries, actually, in terms of numbers, Tonga and Vanuatu. And as the name suggests, government takes a relatively modest role. Right? A lot of the work is done by the private sector. So recruitment is done by employers, right? And or by their agents, whether formal or informal. So in Vanuatu, agents are licensed. I think there are some 60 of them now. In Tonga, they're not licensed, right? But they exist. Right? They operate. They're not illegal, right? It's not a regulated sector. And these they do the bulk of the work. So the private sector players not only recruit the workers, but they also often get involved in the visa process, right? Helping them to do the necessary police and health checks to get them through. Perhaps they help out with the pre-departure briefing, right? So the government is poorly resourced and plays a minimalist role. So we heard about the work-ready pool this morning. Tonga has a work-ready pool, and some employers use it for their first time. But apart from that, it's not used. When employers use their agents, they use returning workers to suggest new workers when they need them. And Vanuatu, which is 40% of the 2 schemes, doesn't even have a work-ready pool in operation anymore. The agents and employers also do most of the promotion and pastoral care, right? How did Tonga and Vanuatu get so well known? Well, these agents were on the phone, they were going to visit farms, and in Tonga they had the diaspora that made a lot of the connections. So that the whole process was an organic one rather than led by government. So that's the government light model. And then the other model we see in place is the government central, right? And obviously this is at the other extreme where the government takes the lead role. And this is best exemplified by Timor-Leste, right, which has really made this model work. So here there is a work-ready pool, and you have to hire from that pool. You can still have return workers. Right? You don't have to change over your workforce every year, but that means 5 minutes. Yeah. You you can have return workers, but when you want new workers, you have to go back to the pool. Timor-Leste in the past, in fact, earlier, allowed employers to add their own new suggested workers to the pool, but not anymore. Right? If you want new workers, you have to come back to the pool. Employers get a short list from that work-ready pool, and they select on the basis of that. They can do interviews on the phone, or they can go and visit. The visas are processed by the Timor-Leste government. In fact, that's done in Canberra, and that's the other distinctive feature of this, is a very heavy in-country presence. So in comparison to Vanuatu, which has no receiving country presence, and Tonga, which has a very light receiving country presence, Timor for a long time has had 2 people in Canberra or in Australia dedicated to the seasonal worker program alone, both promoting the scheme to employers and troubleshooting problem solving. So these are the 2 models, and this is just a sort of categorization. I think I've gone over this. In terms of our classification, we welcome your feedback on this, but this is how we classify the countries: the 2 government light of Vanuatu and Tonga, the 2 government central, Timor-Leste and PNG, and then the others are in between. These are 2 ends of a spectrum, and the other countries fall somewhere in between those 2 ends. So what are the pros and cons of these 2 approaches? Well, the government central one is more of a burden on government, obviously. Government light is better if your government is under-resourced, right, or not prepared to commit to these schemes. Conversely, the government central one only works if government is responsive to employers. And in PNG, that's where they fell down. They set up this government central scheme, but the government unit then wasn't responsive to employers. And we know if we ask employers, they will prefer direct recruitment. The government central one may be more equitable and reduce brain drain, because government's hiring, they can go out to rural areas, so they can ask communities to select people. On the other hand, if they get it wrong, as I mentioned, they'll go to the cities, and it won't be equitable at all. Government central means you don't need agents. In the government light model, we have agents, and we know that reliance on agents is risky. Right? As was mentioned, agents sometimes charge fees to workers, which they're not meant to do, and there are other problems as well. Having a strong receiving country presence is important because it helps you solve problems when they come up with workers, and they help you promote. On the other hand, if you've got a lot of strong private sector presence and agents, they'll promote the program for you. So there's a variety of pros and cons. In terms of numbers, definitely the government light has worked best. Right? If we look at Vanuatu and Tonga's dominance of the scheme, that's the only conclusion you can reach. However, this model does bring it reputational risks, such as agents charging worker fees, too many agents, workers inadequately briefed, absconding workers, and blacklists being circumvented. And we certainly have been advocating that both Vanuatu and Tonga need to invest more in the schemes, so move away from that government light somewhat in terms of receiving country presence and sending country regulation. Timor-Leste definitely shows the government central model can be made to work, but it is a very demanding model. I think not one we'd recommend for most countries. I think the good news is that governance arrangements aren't fixed. They change over time, and countries can learn from their mistakes. So Timor-Leste originally, didn't select well into that pool, but it's learned from that, and it now selects more from rural areas. Solomon Islands had the opposite problem. They had a sort of government-light approach with heavy reliance on agents. That didn't work at all for them, and they've now moved towards having a more government role. So that's a sort of encouraging note. So to wrap up, country success in the 2 schemes is highly variable. There are a range of factors that explain this, but whether the SWP and RSE can support large participation from more than 3 countries each remains to be seen. I think that is a challenge. We certainly need more research. And then just to summarise, we've tried to come up with this characterisation around government central and government light. Government light works best for numbers, but carries reputational risks. Government central can be made to work, but it's a demanding model. So yeah, somewhat disappointing conclusion, but we feel most governments want to be somewhere in the middle between these 2 extremes. But then this note that they are dynamic, they're not set in stone. And we do think that this sort of can be, we can see more positive change if we have more negotiations between the sending countries and the receiving countries, and if we hear more from the voice of the workers and the employers. Right? If we have a more sort of deliberative approach then the pressures that are on the system can be more clearly articulated and governments will be able to act more quickly to improve things. So, Bula Vanaka, thank you very much, everyone. And please don't forget to sign up for our newsletter and do contact us if you're interested in this research. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, for that presentation. Moving forward, we only have one more presentation left, so take a deep breath. Lunch is just around the corner. May I introduce to you the Vanuatu Labour Commissioner, Mario Meltinoven, who will be presenting from a Vanuatu perspective, the experiences, the legal framework, challenges and success, and also the way forward. We do have Matt Gibbs here. I had asked him, have you got a presentation? And he replied, what are you talking about? We come here to conferences just to chill. I don't have a presentation. So, but please, all questions, you can redirect it all to Matt at the end of Stephen and Mario's presentation. So please welcome Mario, who will be presenting from a Vanuatu perspective. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for allowing me the opportunity to present our experience from Vanuatu Labour Department perspective, and we are the department responsible for the management of the Labour Mobility Program back home. So my presentation will focus on our experience in terms of remittances, the success stories, what are the challenges, and some of the way forwards that we are trying to put in place in order to better manage the 3 labour mobility programs that we have at the moment. So in Vanuatu, we have 3 labour mobility programs, and namely the recognized seasonal employment, RSE with the New Zealand government, and the implementation arrangement commenced way back in 2007. We have the Seasonal Workers Program, SWP, with the Australian government, and the implementation arrangement commenced way back in 2012. And we have the latest Pacific Labour Scheme, PLS program, with the Australian government still, and the implementation arrangement commenced just recently, December 2018. The current legal framework, we do have, back home, we have the Sessional Employment Act, number 23 of 2007, and the legislation was enacted in 2007. So it provides provision on the license and permits, the duties of licensees and permit holders, the responsibilities of the Commissioner of Labour to manage and discipline the license holders. And we also have the Sessional Employment Agency Regulation Order, number 13 of 2017. And the order or regulation specifically deals with administrative arrangement of the RSE program, the pre-departure orientation, the visa requirement, the general requirements on compliance while on seasonal employment, and the monitoring and compliance of the program by Labour Commissioner. Continue with legal framework. The legislation and policy enacted way back in 2007 was developed to set the legal framework for the RSC only. And the SWP and the PLS are not captured specifically in our current legislation and policy. With the recruitment process, I believe Stephen has provided many information about our recruitment process. So in Vanuatu, we have 2 types of recruitment process. One recruitment process is done through local agent, and they are representing the labor hire agent in Vanuatu, recruiting for the approved employers back in Australia and New Zealand. And we also have the direct recruitment through approved employers in New Zealand and Australia. So those 2 recruitment processes are only specific or applicable to the unskilled program, namely the RSC and SWP. I would like to share with you few figures and statistics on the approved agent as of 2019. And the number for RSC approved agent for 2019 range at 23 agents altogether. And the number of approved employers for 2019 is at 73. Compared to SWP, the approved agent for 2019 has increased to 107, and the number of approved employers is at 32. So all agents and employers are recruited through the issuance of license and permit by the Commissioner of Labor. And there are prescribed fees attached to the permit and license application. And permit and license are issued on a yearly basis. And there is no work-ready pool as recruitment method for Vanuatu. And this has been confirmed by research provided by Stephen and also Richard Curtin. Continue with our recruitment process. The PLS recruitment is strictly implemented by the Employment Services Unit under the Department of Labor. So far, we have 5 workers who have already been recruited, but we are expecting more to come in Vanuatu this year. And Vanuatu agents are not allowed under the terms and conditions of the MOU to recruit for the PLS program. The current recruitment process comprises of industries such as agriculture, tourism, hospitality, meat workers. So far, we have 5 employers coming over to recruit more on the 4 industry that have mentioned. Few statistics that I would like to share with you on the labor mobility program for Vanuatu as of June 2019. As you can see in the graphics, so far, the number for RSC has been increased for the month of May compared to SWP. And PLS, we are slowly increasing our number in terms of active participation by workers. Some of the success stories that I would like to share with you. You can see the blue building is Doctor's House in one of the islands of AP, and it was built by more than 100 RSC workers and was opened in 2017 and was handed over to the government to form part and support the government as part of its decentralization policy to make sure that some of our health services are relocated back to the community. The second picture is a worker from Pele who built his bungalow at Pele Island, and he is also an RSC worker and has been in New Zealand for 3 seasons. So the Doctor's House took workers, the 100 workers, about 3 years for them to achieve that project. In terms of remittances, the figures below are figures collected from the Reserve Bank of Vanuatu from the period 2016 to 2018. And as you can see, the program has benefited our government a lot in terms of remittances, and it has contributed a lot to our GDP. So we have success stories, we have remittances, but we do have many challenges while implementing the program. So our biggest challenge at the moment is financial constraint, and we also lack resources in terms of office space. We lack human resource from the sending country to manage all the 3 programs. We also lack the monitoring and compliance of the agent's conduct, employer's conduct, and workers' conduct. We do not have a proper database system in place. Our legislation is outdated. It has been enacted some 10 or 11 years way back, and it needs to be under-reviewed. One of the major problems is also the exchange rate. Our currency is very strong, and when workers return back home, they are very disappointed when they change their money from Australian dollar, New Zealand dollar back to Vatu. And also, we do not have liaison officers on the ground, and this is something that we are really pushing our government to make sure that by 2020, we must be appointing liaison officers in New Zealand and in Australia to help us address issues and maximize problems. Some of the way forward. The current way forward adopted by our government is the development of our national labor mobility policy to accommodate all recommendations put forward by Mr. Richard Curtin. And I would like to thank Richard Curtin. He has been doing a very fantastic job for us, Vanuatu, and he has been providing some very good recommendations. And our Ministry for Foreign Affairs is now taking the lead on the drafting of our national labor mobility policy. We are also reviewing the current legislation to address all the 3 programs, and we are also deciding on what will be the best terminology to use for the policy and legislation, whether we should name it labor mobility policy legislation versus labor migration policy or legislation. So these are some issues that we are going to discuss at government level, and to make sure that the terminology used for the policy and legislation reflect the reality for the labor mobility program. Continue with way forward. We are also addressing the restructuring for the department to strengthen the compliance of the program by agents, employers, and workers. We also are working very hard to make sure that we relocate to a new office space with new building, new training rooms to accommodate more employers. We work a lot in partnership with training institutions such as APTC for the proper implementation arrangement of the PLS program. And we are also working very hard to make sure that we have proper reintegration policy on the ground, just to support the reintegration of return workers when they're back home, how they can invest their money, and what sort of business we want to see them invest their money into. And we are also proposing to re-establish the work-ready pool to make sure that our recruitment process for the labor mobility program are transparent, without any nepotism, islandism, and without incurring more complaints from the general public. So I think this is the end of my presentation. Thank you, Tomas, Vina Vakalevu, and I will be happy to answer any further questions. Thank you.
Thank you once again, Muriel, for that fantastic presentation. Matt had, you can notice, moved over and reminded me that our Pacific Island sense of humor can cost him his job. He actually, he doesn't have a, sorry, Matt. Matt actually will have a couple of minutes to share with us from New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So without any further ado, please everyone give Matt a big applause as he comes and gives us a cue.
Malione is like my sister. Of course, I love her, but I'm very happy that there's a big blue ocean between us. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come and talk to you today. I think these forums are very important for fleshing out what some of the issues and opportunities are within this very important, I think it's very important, labor mobility. And today I'm going to speak to you a little bit about my... Sorry, can you hear me? All right, here we go. Did you get my joke before, or did you want to, shall I say it again? All right. So today we're talking about governance, and as Malione said, I've been involved with seasonal or temporary labor mobility for about a decade or so, since the RSE began, and have worked in a variety of different roles in and around labor mobility, both in the Pacific and in receiving countries as well. So I guess firstly I just wanted to acknowledge Muriel as well. That was a great presentation and highlight some of the things that I wanted to speak about. In fact, Muriel and I I followed Muriel around the bottom of the South Island recently, around the Cherry regions. And I can tell you that Muriel is a great navigator and also a hard negotiator. So looking at governance, Stephen talked in some good detail there about the actual operation of labour mobility. And I guess from my perspective, having a law, although never practiced background, I came at this topic thinking about what I've seen in my own experiences over these last 10 or so years. And I guess put simply, for me, it begins with governance at the highest level. The executive stating what are the objectives, what is labour mobility for us, what do we want from labour mobility for our people, and where do we want it to take us. And those objectives are then enshrined in legislation and regulations. Policy then to operationalise the intent of the legislation and regulation, which is then applied by responsible officials through operational process. Data collection, of course, is key, and regular reporting back to the executive to inform continuous improvement. And broadly, that's how I would see policies, programs like this operating. And of course, in a perfect world in New Zealand, that would be nice, but it doesn't work that way as often as we like. I do believe that that a mandate needs to be clearly established at the point of the bilateral relationship when labour mobility is put forward at the earliest stages of discussion. What I guess is equally important is having a stable platform at the senior official level. As we know in politics, right throughout our region, and I'm thinking about my friends in Australia particularly, leadership changes regularly, and so too with it the ideas of how things should be done. And I suppose having that senior official platform, which is a cross-agency, provides that stability when there is less stability at the political level. Resourcing. It's just so important to a successful program. And what I see from my own just travels and experience is that the people in the labour sending units, Muriel and her staff, put in far more work than they are ever going to be paid for. And that's unsustainable. And so it comes down to providing the information, the data, the research back up to the executive to show the importance, the value, not just in economic terms, but in social terms, of labour mobility, and why the government needs to invest heavily in Muriel and her team and her department. Effective communication is also important, and technology where it makes sense. I think, Muriel, you talked a little bit about data capture and being able to capture data and the difficulty that you and your team over the years have experienced with that. And I think that that's true probably across most Pacific states, but also if I reflect in New Zealand as well. We're very siloed in New Zealand. We collect lots of information, but it's not shared across the different sections that deal with immigration. For example, the Department of Labour within our super ministry, MB, doesn't talk that much with immigration. And then there's immigration policy. And so what we find is that actually there's a lot of things going on that we just don't know about, simply because we don't know to ask those questions. We're not structured necessarily in a way which allows that information to naturally flow. Pre-departure training, and I'm sorry, this is a little bit all over the place. These are just thoughts that came to me when I realized I was going to give a presentation and I didn't have one. Pre-departure training also is key, and it's such a difficult thing to do and do well. In an ideal world, it would be something that was delivered over a longer period of time, but that involves people traveling some great distances. Where do they stay? Who's going to front that cost? What is it that they're learning? Who is it that's delivering those messages? And how do those messages get communicated back home to the families? And what we often see, there's a disconnect between the person that's receiving the information and the information that they themselves communicate back to their families and communities that they come from. And that leads to misunderstanding and expectations that are out of kilter with the reality of spending a long period of time overseas. I guess, how we go for time, still going okay. Clear and transparent processes are really clear and are really important, and that comes through the policy. Officials are often, and Muriel, you might speak about this at some point, but officials are often accused by community members of not considering them on the basis that they feel that there is some nepotism or some reason that they're not being included in that. And it's hard to argue against that. Even though it's not true, it's hard to argue against it when you can't point to a written process or a clear policy which says, this is the reason, these are the criteria you must meet. If you meet these criteria, you will be considered. That doesn't mean that you get a job necessarily, you still have to be recruited. And it's difficult to get those messages across even just within a localized region of the capital, let alone further out to remote rural communities. Puts a lot more pressure onto sending countries and sending units. And then I guess the last thing I would say is just the review and continuous improvement, and Muriel's talked a little bit about that, and we really support that. We MFAT and DFAT, I know, are working to support all the Pacific states as best we can with that process, but recognizing that the systems that are in place are the systems that work for that country, and the best that I suppose that we can do is just be a supportive partner in the continuous development of labour mobility. A couple of last quick things, if I can, Chair. Yep. Chair. Sister. So in New Zealand we have this conundrum. RSE, or labour mobility, is viewed in terms as RSE, and actually it's not. There's thousands of other people from the Pacific coming to New Zealand to fill temporary roles in a variety of different areas. And in fact, the Pacific makes up only about 6% of temporary entry work permits, of which Fiji, in fact, makes up 5 of that 6%. And so the question for us is, what is labour mobility? It's not just seasonal, although seasonal makes it easier because it's circular and it's easier to see the returns back to the Pacific state. But actually, it encompasses a much broader, for New Zealand, range of sectors than we had thought. And this is part of the problem that we have with our siloed state, is that, for example, for the last 10 years, about 250 workers from Samoa have been coming into New Zealand to fill roles in the meat packing and processing industry. And we only became really aware of that in the last 6 months, and saw then the opportunity, oh, well, maybe we could open this up to a much wider audience. Maybe there's, many others or other Pacific states that would also benefit from these opportunities. But it means engaging with industry as well as to finding out what the risks and the benefits are of doing that. But again, it comes down to knowing that before, well before we actually find out. Okay, that's it.
Thank you, brother. Thank you very much, Matt, for that presentation. And now we will move on to the questions. Please do note, here in the Pacific, food is very important, and therefore food is calling us very soon. Let's keep our questions short. Let's not turn a question into a speech. Let's introduce ourselves, have our names, as I asked before, names and the institution, so that we can understand the context. And now I'll just look to the ushers. If you have any questions for anyone that have presented, please just raise your hands and we'll take on a couple of questions. Thank you. Got one question from the back.
Thank you. I just finished the tea in the morning. We were just discussing the same issue that you're now presenting to us. There's always lingering questions for me, because whenever there's a presentations of labor mobility, there's no history and background being mentioned, how this thing was being initiated. Because in the Pacific, we always be suspicious of anything done by the Australian and New Zealand to us, especially when the Chinese are visiting us. So my question is, because nobody has come up with this, does the call by the PIFs through the influence of Fiji, calling the excluding of Australia and New Zealand from the Pacific, as this has been used as an enticement for us to be befriend of this scheme? Because I know that it's still a temporary scheme. So just like the New Zealand official has said, it just depends on those people who come on power. So it's temporary, so it's just there today, maybe tomorrow it'll disappear. So secondly, the stats that shows, does the stats shows that those who signed the PISA Plus have high statistics? Because PNG and Fiji and Papua New Guinea did not sign yet. Their statistics still at a very minimum, 1%, 1 and 2%. Third is Timor-Leste really go up. Does that shows the interest, Australian interest in their gas resource as the back pay for them, for their loyalty? So because we have been told to be critical, so.
Thank you.
So for Vanuatu, for the Labour Commissioner, I really love about your statistics. I would love to see the statistics about the people of when they move for that engagement, of what industry that have been involved in the period of time that the scheme, that those people have moved on. Either which industry, either from the grapes or so the grapes or the meat industry of the month of January, April. So in the Pacific, we would like to know what the industry really engage on our people. Because I just joked to our Labour Commissioner here, when you see that grapes there, it needs a Timor-Leste people to do harvesting, not the Pacific people. They are really big people there.
Sorry, sir. I've got to interrupt. That was probably 3 questions and a speech. I would let the presenters tackle that question and answer that, while anyone else that is, we'll give another space for 2 questions. While the presenters answer that, please think your question through and frame it, and let's get and stick to the time. We haven't got much time left, so we'll take 2 more questions, but I'll let the speakers address that one. Thank you.
All right, thank you. It is a slightly different topic, but I have written a paper about it. And the history is interesting because in 2006, when the Pacific asked for this seasonal worker program, New Zealand said yes and Australia said no. So Australia has changed its mind over time. And that's why has Australia changed its mind? I think there are various reasons, but certainly one is China. I think we're more worried about China, and that's why we're stepping up. So it's a key part of the step up. in Australia's, for a whole range of reasons. Australia wants to do better. And then there is that employer, now growing employer demand. So although, I mean, you're right, the schemes could be abandoned, but I think now they're so well established and they do have a employer lobby behind them, it's unlikely they're going to be removed. And on PACER Plus, I mean, that's also, it goes to this point because actually the PLS was tied to PACER Plus. And so you weren't meant to participate in PLS unless you'd signed PACER Plus. But Australia has now admitted Fiji and PNG into PACER Plus, into PLS, even though they haven't signed the PACER Plus. So that just shows how keen Australia has become on this and how, yeah, maybe we're sort of thinking like, you know, recognising, this is my interpretation anyway, I mean, the trade relationship, you know, between Australia and the small island countries is not going to be as important as the labour mobility relationship. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else that got a question? Go. Yep. Oh, yep. Lara, sorry.
Okay. Thank you, sir, for your question. In relation to Vanuatu industry that are available for the RSC and SWP program, we do have horticulture, viticulture, and it's all about fruit picking. So for the PLS one, because it's a semi-skilled program, the industries that are available for Vanuatu workers are agriculture, tourism, hospitality, meat workers, aged care, and aged care for disabled people. So at the moment for the PLS, we have been, our implementation arrangement has already commenced on the industry of agriculture and tourism, hospitality, and we are now in the phase of finalizing our recruitment for the meat workers. They are due to depart probably sometime this month or next month. And we are piloting it for 10 workers first to go over to Australia. And if their performance is excellent, then the employer might come back to Vanuatu to recruit more. Thank you.
And I guess just to add my bit to that around the temporary nature of seasonal labour mobility. It is, first and foremost, from a New Zealand perspective, an industry-driven program. So without the demand from industry, there wouldn't be this program, essentially. What we are seeing at the moment is unprecedented or very, very low levels of unemployment in New Zealand. And that said, it's still a New Zealand first preference, no matter what. The same here in Fiji, of course, as you would expect. However, with the expansion of the New Zealand productive sector, demand from China, the fact is that we just don't have enough people. And like Australia, New Zealand, when we developed this policy, put a Pacific preference in there. It's not that employers can't go to other parts of the world, because they certainly can, but first of all they have to demonstrate why they can't find the people they need in the Pacific. So you'll have seen from Stephen's presentation that not all of RSC workers that come to New Zealand, or not all the RSC visas that are issued to people from the Pacific. They're also issued to people from Thailand and Indonesia and Malaysia principally.
Thank you. We'll probably have time for just one more question. We can think. Sorry, got a gentleman here.
Humphrey Chang, private sector, and championing for the SMEs. I'm troubled with the word return workers. I don't understand why there are so many return workers going back to the same employer. I know it's good for the employer because he knows the person, maybe that the trend is being set for them. But it's in the expense of the national interest. And I think we should be doing something like sharing of wealth, training, and giving opportunity for the many school leavers that don't have job and can't find job. Any research made in as to why people want to, the blame is also with the government of the country for allowing that same person to go back. And I don't agree with it.
Thank you for that comment. Would anyone want to take that? And then there's one last question from the other corner after this.
Thank you. My name is Robin. I'm from Papua New Guinea. My question is around the issue of government central, the two models that were explained by colleague from ANU. For PNG, we have a large base of unemployment in the informal sector. And I'm quite disturbed seeing that there are more recruitment in other smaller countries like Cook Islands, Tonga, and the others. And we make a population of, we have 87,000 labor entrants. 11,000 of those are, well, I'm noting from the presentations earlier. And my question is, why is that so? Why do we recruit more from the other countries than the others? Could it be attributed to the type of system we have? For example, PNG is the government central approach that is being used. Or is it because the employers in the two countries prefer to recruit more in other countries than the others? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll let the presenters deal with those two questions. I think we have time just to answer those.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to respond to the questions on return workers. From Vanuatu experience, we've seen that the challenge why we have the same people returning back to the program is because we don't have proper policy in place to address our recruitment process. Australia and New Zealand have offered that labor mobility program to us, and it is about the sending country to put in place proper policy on how they choose to recruit. Because back home, we have so many skilled people who have left their job just because the labor mobility program is a greener pasture for them. So we can't stop them to be engaged in the program because it will be obviously against their constitutional rights. So what we are doing is once that national labor mobility policy is implemented or put in place, we're going to be really strict on how the recruitment process will take place, and we are going to focus on people who don't have any employment. The priority should be delegated to them. Yeah, so that's some small contribution I can provide, but I believe my two colleagues have more ideas to share with all of us. Thank you.
Thanks, Mira. Also, just to respond to that question too, I think I agree and disagree with you in equal measures. I understand from an industry perspective why they prefer workers to visit, to work for them more than one season. I think it's, it's obvious. But I also recognise, and I think that came through in Stephen's data, was that there's a natural length of time that people are coming to Australia and New Zealand, about 4 years. But what I think that we can do better is what you've talked about, is how do we identify people coming up through the school system who perhaps are unsure what they want to do. How do we work with those through career guidance to interest them in going through vocational or other types of training with a viewpoint to linking that to employment in either Australia or New Zealand, where they can then gain Australian and New Zealand qualifications, because that's certainly what can happen in New Zealand, and a number of a growing number of workers from the Pacific that come to New Zealand under RSE obtain a level 1 and 2 horticultural qualification while they're in New Zealand. So they can bring that back, of course, but how do we put some more system and framework around that so that more people have those opportunities? And I think that's the next challenge for labour mobility.
Stephen?
Yeah, I think we just have to be careful not to apply too much of a double standard. Like you'd never say, okay, teachers, you could teach this year and then you can be the teacher next year and you can be the teacher next year because we don't want return teachers, right? So it is a private sector. It's a private sector phenomenon. The government shouldn't be getting involved in these kind of employer-worker relations. In fact, I said Timor has this government central model, and in fact, they wanted to take it to the next step, which is not only you have to recruit from the work-ready pool, but you can't have return workers. Every time you've got to recruit new. And the employers basically said, no way. You do that, we're out of here. We're going to go to Vanuatu or Tonga. And that's what I was trying to say, right? I know it's tempting to think there's a trade-off. More return workers means fewer new workers, but that's actually misleading. If you look at the data, more return workers means employers are happier with your country. They're going to recruit more new workers. So and we need to adjust our thinking on that. And on PNG, we've certainly agree that PNG should be a much bigger player. And Richard Curtin, of course, has written a report about this. And I'm sure he'd be happy to talk with you, Robin. I think it's basically, in terms of those central functions, PNG's got to get those working better so that it's more responsive to employers, but also perhaps just loosen up a bit, allow more of that direct contact and recruitment between employers and the workers they need. But yeah, we'd be very happy to talk with you about that further.
Thank you. I think that's the beauty of having this session before lunchtime. You do have an hour to still meet up during lunchtime if you have any opinions or any questions that you'd like to take on further with our presenters. We can have that discussion over lunchtime, but I think it's important that we wrap up the session. May I once again take the opportunity to thank Stephen House, Meryl, and also Matt for the presentations this morning. Thank you to everyone. Now let's go have some lunch. Thank you.
In this modern day and age, things must be improved and streamlined. Yeah. You can't keep going doing the same thing. Right.
Oh yeah, Beth will handle everything.
Oh, right.
Right, no, that's in terms of using it.
Okay. Oh, great. Thank you. Just
Mariel, let's go eat some food now. That was awesome.
Yeah, great.
Sorry, John Murd from Department of Education City, but I've done quite a lot of work in Vanuatu. Fairly recently I was working with a guy called Pierre Metzar. Pierre Metzar. There's no Metzar in your name. Your brother, you look familiar. He's such a nice person at the Ministry of Education and AUL. Likewise. I was, last time I was there was in
he knows. Ranesh already has
driven away, but
yeah, Stefan Hall will be the other.
What's happening with reviewing
Which
your
one do you want to
legislation,
open?
with the seasonal worker legislation? Is that somebody?
Yeah, they do, yeah.
Which one do you want? That's Stefan Hall? This one? Yeah, then you just label my group. That's Stefan. The other one is already there, so just say this one. Oh God.
Is it happening? Oh, good. That's good. Please pass my fond regards to Pierre. He's a lovely person to work with.
No, this one. I know. So, yeah. You can just...
I have seen here.
Yeah, okay.
Most of this is up in the center.
There you go. Yeah, I haven't got any of the others. They're not as organised. So, because it's come out with this at the bottom,
There needs to be more than a security system.
No, that's right. That's right. But that's not the scheme, right? That's the unregulated schemes. Yeah. So the good thing that's happening is that there's been a lot of illegal labour in Australian farms, but now the government is cracking down more. There's been a public outcry. There were some media cases.
Because I think
So even now the supermarkets. Oh, that was in New Zealand. Yeah, that was a car crash. That wasn't here. That was next. But no, there's been a lot of exploitation, but now the government's cracking down. Even the supermarkets.
Now the farmers, it's more difficult for them to do this sort of thing. So that's why